Welcome back to your next chapter in the History of Protestantism by James A. Wiley. I'm Nicholas Arthur, and you are listening to Prophecy Reformation Now. Because God-given prophecy is history in advance, it is very important for the Christian to learn about the history of the church that Jesus said he would build, starting about 2,000 years ago when he said, "I will build my church." Only if we truly understand history can we find our place in the prophecy of the Revelation, and perhaps even come to know what must shortly come to pass in our own time as well. So, let us pick up right where we left off last time. The education of the youth of the state was an object of special care to the magistrates, who desired that they should be early grounded in the principles of virtue and piety, as well as in a knowledge of the classical tongues, and the belles lettres. For this end they erected a school or academy with competent professors, to whom they gave suitable salaries. There was a school in Geneva in Popish times, but it was so badly managed that it accomplished nothing for the interests of education. The Council General, by a decree of May 21st, 1536, established a new seminary in the convent of the Cordeliers on the Rive, and appointed as headmaster Antony Saunier, the countryman and friend of Farel. The latter sought in divers places for learned men willing to be teachers in this school. On the same 21st of May, there was witnessed a solemn sight at Geneva. The whole body of the citizens, the magistrates and ministers at their head, assembled in the Cathedral of St. Peter, and with uplifted hands swore to renounce the doctrine of the Roman Church, the Mass and all that depends on it, and to live according to the laws of the Gospel. This national vow included the regulations we have just enumerated, which were regarded as necessary deductions from the great Christian law. Soon after this, Farel composed in conjunction with Calvin, who by this time had joined him, a brief and simple confession of faith, in 21 articles, which was sworn to by all the citizens of the state, who appeared before the council in relays of tens, and had the oath administered to them. This was in the November following. To mark the laying of the foundation of their Protestant state, and the new age therewith introduced, the Genevans struck a new coin and adopted a new motto for their city. In the times of paganism, being worshippers of the sun, they had taken that luminary as their symbol. Lastly, retaining the radical idea in their symbol, they had modified and enlarged it into the following motto: Post tenebras spero lucem, i.e., after the darkness, I hope for the light. Words which look like an unconscious prophecy of a time of knowledge and truth in the future. Having established their Reformation, the Genevans changed their motto once more: Post tenebras lucem, after darkness, light, was stamped on the new money of the state, as if to intimate that the light they looked for was now come. Finally, an enduring monument of this great event, the citizens placed in a tablet of brass in front of the town house, with a declaration of their Protestantism engraved upon it, 1535. Never did more modest tablet record greater victory. That victory was too great, in truth, to be represented by any monument of marble. No pomp of words, no magnificence of art could express its value. Protestantism, now planted on this spot, which the struggles, the blood, and the prayers of believing men had won for it, in the midst of Christendom, rising aloft in its own majesty, and shining by its own splendor, must be its own monument, or, if other memorial is to have, it must be just such simple record of accomplished facts as this tablet contains. But in truth, when the Genevans placed their memorial stone in front of their Senate house, they did not know half the worth of the victory they had won. No man at that day could even guess at the many brilliant triumphs which lay folded up in this one triumph. It required a century to evolve them. What is it that the men of Geneva have done? According to their own account, they have rescued a little city from tyranny and superstition, and consecrated to it a liberty and pure Christianity. This does not seem much. Had it been a great throne or a powerful realm, it would have been something. But a third-rate town, with only a few leagues of territory, what is that? Besides, Geneva may be lost tomorrow. May not Spain and France come in any hour and extinguish its liberties? They believe they may, and they make the attempt, but only to find that while their armies are melting away and their empires dissolving, the sway of the little Protestant town is every year widening. Very diminutive is the spot, but the beacon light does not need a continent for a pedestal. A little rock will do, and while the winds howl and the billows shake their angry crests and roll their thundering surges around its base, its ray still burns aloft, and streaming far and wide over the waves, pierces the black night and guides the bark of the mariner. What was it the ancient sage demanded in order to be able to move the world? Only a fixed point. Geneva was that fixed point. We shall see it in the course of time become the material basis of a great moral empire. Chapter 10. Calvin enters Geneva. The Civil and Ecclesiastical Constitution. Calvin at the gates of Geneva. Farel told. Meeting of Farel and Calvin. Is this the author of the Institutes? Adjuration. Calvin remains in Geneva. Commences as lecturer in the cathedral. His confession of faith. Excommunication. What is it? Morality, the cornerstone of the new state. Civil Constitution of the Republic. The Council General. The Council of 200. The Council of 25. The Syndics. The Consistory, or Church Court. Distinction between the civil and ecclesiastical powers. Calvin's ideas on the relations between church and state. Guizot's testimony. Calvin's ideal in advance of his age. One day toward the end of August 1536, a stranger, a slender figure and pale face, presented himself at the gates of Geneva. There was nothing to distinguish him from the crowds of exiles who were then arriving almost daily at the same gates, except it might be the greater brightness that burned in his eye. He had come to rest only for a night, and depart on the morrow. But as he traversed the streets on his way to his hotel, a former acquaintance, du Tillet, some say, Caroli, say others, recognized him, and instantly hurried off to tell Farel that Calvin was in Geneva. When nearly a year ago we parted with Calvin, he was on his way across the Alps to visit Renée, the daughter of Louis XII of France, and wife of Hercules d'Este, Duke of Ferrara. He entered Italy, as he himself said, only to leave it, though not till he had confirmed the illustrious princess at whose court he sojourned in her attachment to the Protestant faith, in which, despite the many and peculiar trials to which her constancy exposed her, she steadfastly continued to her life's end. His eldest brother dying, Calvin recrossed the mountains on a hasty journey to his birthplace, most probably to arrange the family affairs, and leave Noyon forever. Where shall he go? Where shall he next go? The remembrance of the studious days he passed at Basel returned to him with irresistibly attractive force, and now, accompanied by his brother Antoine and his sister Maria, he was on his way to his former retreat. But the direct road through Lorraine was blocked up by the armies of Charles V, and this compelled him to make a detour by Switzerland, which brought him to the gates of Geneva. With startled but thankful surprise, Farel received the news that the author of the Christian Institutes was in the city. God, he thought, had sent, at a critical moment, the man of all others whom he most wished to associate with himself in the work of reforming Geneva. Farel had begun to feel the difficulty of the task he had in hand. To break this people from their habits of lawless indulgence, nurtured by the contests in which they had won their liberty, would indeed be no easy matter. They would spurn all attempts to coerce them, and yield only to the force of a stronger will, and the sway of a loftier genius. Besides, the highest organizing skill was demanded in the man who should set up the moral tribunal in the midst of this licentious city, and found on this unpromising spot an empire which should pervade, with its regenerating spirit, nations afar off, and generations yet unborn. Believing that he had found in Calvin one who possessed all these great qualities, Farel was already on his way to visit him. Farel now stands before the author of the Institutes. He beholds a man of small stature and sickly mind. Were these the shoulders on which he should lay a burden which would have tasked even the strength of Atlas? We can well believe that Farel experienced some moments of painful misgivings. To reassure himself, he had to recall to mind, doubtless, the profound wisdom, the calm strength, and the sublimity of principle displayed on every page of the Institutes. That was the real Calvin. Now Farel began to press his suit. He was here combating alone. He had to do daily battle against an atrocious tyranny outside the city, and against a licentious libertinism within it. "Come," he said to the young reformer, "and be my comrade in the campaign." Calvin's reply was a refusal. His constructive and practical genius was then unknown even to himself. His sphere, he believed, was his library, his proper instrument of work, his pen. And to cast himself into a scene like that before him was, he believed, to extinguish himself. Panting to be at Basel or at Strasbourg, or speaking from the sanctuary of a studious and laborious privacy, he could edify all the churches, he earnestly besought Farel to stand aside and let him go on his way. But Farel would not stand aside. Putting on something of the authority of an ancient prophet, he commanded the young traveler to remain and labor in Geneva, and he imprecated upon his studies the curse of God should he make them the pretext for declining the call now addressed to him. It was the voice not of Farel, but of God, that now spoke to Calvin, so he felt, and instantly he obeyed. He loved, in later life, to recall that fearful adjuration, which was, he would say, as if God from on high had stretched out his hand to stop me. Calvin's journey was now at an end. He had reached the spot where his life's work was to be done. Here, in this gray city, clinging to its narrow rocky site, the calm lake at its feet, and the glories of the distant mountains in its sky, he was for 28 years to toil and wage battle and endure defeat. But to keep marching on through toil and defeat, to more glorious victory in the end than warrior ever won with his sword, and then he would fall and sleep, and rest by the banks of that river whose arrowy stream he had crossed but a few minutes before. He gave his hand to Farel, and in doing so, he gave himself to Geneva. If the destiny of Calvin was from that moment changed, if from a student he became a legislator and leader, If from being a soldier in the ranks he became General Amicio of the armies of Protestantism, not less was the destiny of Geneva from that moment changed. Calvin had already written a book that constituted an epoch in Protestantism, but he was to write a second time, though not with pen and ink. He would display before all Christendom the Institutes not as a volume of doctrines, but a system of realized facts. A state rescued from the charnel house of corruption and raised to the glorious heritage of liberty and virtue, glorious in art, in letters, and in riches, because resplendent with every Christian virtue. To write Protestantism upon their banners, to proclaim it in their edicts, to install it as a worship in their churches, Calvin and all the reformers held to be but a small affair. What they strove above all things to achieve was to plant it as an operative moral force in the hearts of men, and at the foundation of states. Calvin was now at the age of 27. The magistrates of Geneva welcomed him, but with a cautious reserve, if we may judge from the first mention of his name in the registers of the city, about a fortnight after his arrival, as that Frenchman. He was appointed to give lectures on the Scriptures and to preach. Beza styles him doctor or professor of sacred letters. But as yet no academy existed, and his lectures were delivered in a cathedral. As regards the later function, that of preacher, it was some time before Calvin would assume it. When at length he appeared in the pulpit as pastor, he spoke with an eloquence so simple and clear, yet so majestic and luminous, that his audience continued daily to grow. He had already done a winter's work, but had received scarcely any wages, for we read in the council registers, under date February 13th, 1537, 6 gold crowns are given to Calvin, seeing that he has hitherto scarcely received anything. It was not long till Calvin's rare genius for system and organization began to display itself. Within 3 months from the commencement of his labors in Geneva, he had, in conjunction with Farel, compiled a brief but comprehensive creed, setting forth the leading doctrines of the Christian faith. To this he added a catechism, not that in question and answer for children which we now possess, but one adapted to adults. The Genevans, with uplifted hands, had embraced Protestantism. Calvin would show them what that Protestantism was which they had professed, and what were the moral duties which it demanded of all its adherents. The Genevans had lifted up their hands. Had they bowed their hearts? This was the main question with him. He had no trust in blind obedience. Knowledge must be the cornerstone of the new state, the foundations of which he was now laying. We can give here only the briefest outline of this confession of faith, placing the Word of God in the foreground as the one fallible authority and the one and sole rule. It proceeds in 21 articles to declare what Scripture teaches touching God, and the plan of redemption which he has provided for man fallen and helpless. It proclaims Christ the one channel of all blessing, the Spirit the one author of all good works, faith the entrance to all these riches, and then goes on to speak of the apparatus set up for offering redemption to men, the sacraments and ministers. Then follow articles on the Church, comprehending the whole body of true believers, on excommunication, or the exclusion from the Church of all manifestly unholy and vicious persons, till then shall have repented. And in fine, on the magistracy and ordinance of God, and to be respected in all ordinances that do not contravene the commandments of God. On the 10th of November, 1536, this confession was received and approved by the Council of 200. To the half-Protestantized citizens of Geneva, the sting of this document was in the end of it, excommunication. The other articles had simply to be professed. This one was heavier than them all, inasmuch as it had to be borne. What did this power import? Was the Protestant excommunication but the papal anathema under another name? Far from it. It carried with it no cruel infliction. It operated in no preternatural or mystic manner, inflicting blight upon the soul. It did not even pronounce on the state of the man before God. It simply found that his life was manifestly unholy, and therefore that he was unfit for a holy society, and in token of his exclusion, it withheld him from the sacraments. No society can exist without laws or rules, but of what use are laws without an executive or tribunal to administer them, and without the right of inflicting penalties? A tribunal would be powerless, and a lighter penalty than excommunication or expulsion would be impossible to conceive or devise. Without this power, the church in Geneva would have been a city without walls and bulwarks. It would have been dissolved the moment it was formed. It is necessary at this stage to refer to the Constitution, civil and ecclesiastical, of Geneva, in order that the course of affairs may be clearly intelligible. The fundamental principle of the state was that the people are the source of power. In accordance therewith came first a convention of all the citizens, termed the Council General. This was the supreme authority. To obviate the confusion and turbulence incident to so large an assembly, a council of 200 was chosen, termed the Great Council. Next came the Little or Ordinary Council, consisting of 25 members, including the 4 syndics of the city. This last, the Council of 25, was the executive, and possessed moreover a large share of the judicial and legislative power. The constitutional machinery we have described in detail was popularly summed up thus: the people, the council, and senate of Geneva. The Council General, that is, the people, was convoked only once a year, in November, to elect the 4 syndics. Besides this annual assembly, it met on important emergencies, or when fundamental changes were to be determined upon, and then only. The actual government of the state was simply in the hands of the Council of 25, which was by constitution largely oligarchical. Such was the Republic when Calvin became a member of it. With Protestantism there arrived a new power in Geneva, the religious, namely, and we complete our picture of the government of the little state when we describe the provision made for the exercise of the ecclesiastical authority. The court or tribunal which took cognizance of church scandals was the consistory. The consistory was composed of the 5 ministers of the city and 12 laymen. It met every Thursday, and the highest penalty it had power to inflict was excommunication, by which is meant expulsion from the church. If this failed to reclaim the offender, the consistory had the right to report the case to the council, and require it to proceed therein according to the laws. In judging of this arrangement, time and circumstances are to be taken into account. The course of affairs at Geneva inevitably tended to graft the ecclesiastical upon the civil government, and to some extent to build up the two in one. It was Protestantism that had called Geneva into existence as a free state. Protestantism was its soul, the center and citadel of its liberties, and whatever tended to weaken or overthrow that principle tended to equally to ruin the Republic. Encompassed on all sides by powerful enemies, this one principle was the bond of their union and the shield of their freedom, and this went far to impart, in many cases, a twofold character to the same action, and to justify the Church in regarding certain acts as sins, and visiting them with her censures, while the state viewed the same acts as crimes, and meted out to them its punishments. Calvin took the Jewish theocracy as his model when he set to work to frame, or rather to complete, the Genevan Republic. What we see on the banks of the Leman is a theocracy. Yahuwah was its head, the Bible was its supreme code, and the government exercised a presiding and paternal guardianship over all interests and causes, civil and spiritual. Geneva, in this respect, was a reproduction of the Old Testament state of society. We of the 19th century regard this as a grave error. At the same time, it must be acknowledged that Calvin grasped the essential distinction between things civil and things ecclesiastical, and the necessity of placing the two under distinct jurisdictions or powers. But his theocratic views produced a dimness and confusion in his ideas on that head, and he was more successful in settling the just limits of the ecclesiastical authority than he was in defining those of the civil jurisdiction. He would not allow a particle of civil power to the consistory, but he was not equally careful to withhold ecclesiastical power from the council. This error arose from his making the Old Testament a model on a point which, we believe, was temporary and local, not permanent and universal. Nevertheless, the Reformer of Geneva stood ahead in this great question of all his predecessors. We may quote here the words of a great statesman and a countryman of Calvin's, who has done justice to the Reformer on this point. A principle, says Guizot, we should rather say a passion, held sway in Calvin's heart, and was his guiding star in the permanent organization of the church which he founded, as well as in his personal conduct during his life. That principle is the profound distinction between civil and the religious community. Distinction, we say, and by no means separation. Calvin, on the contrary, desired alliance between the two communities and the two powers, but each to be independent in its own domain, combining their action, showing mutual respect, and leading mutual support in this principle and this fundamental labor, continues the historian. There are two new and bold reforms attempted in the very heart of the great Reformation of Europe, and over and above the work of its first promoters. In proof, Guizot goes on to instance England, where the royal supremacy was accepted, Switzerland, where the Council of State held the sovereign authority in matters of religion, and Germany, where the magistrate was the chief bishop, and continues, in this great question as to the relations between church and state, Calvin desired and did more than his predecessors in spite of the resistance often shown him by the civil magistrates, in spite of the concessions he was sometimes obliged to make to them. He firmly maintained this principle, and he secured the Reformed Church of Geneva, in purely religious questions and affairs, the right of self-government, according to the faith and the law as they stand written in the holy books. In the statement of facts, Guizot is undoubtedly correct. Only we think that he is mistaken in believing that it was the Church of Rome and the independence of its head, which taught the Reformer the strength and dignity conferred on the Church by having an existence distinct from the civil community. Calvin learned the idea from a diviner source, nor was he quite so successful in extricating the spiritual from the civil jurisdiction, either in idea or in reality, as Guizot appears to think. As regarded the idea, he was embarrassed by the Old Testament theocracy, which he took to be a divine model for all times, and as regarded the actuality, the opposition which he encountered from the civil authority at Geneva made it possible for him to realize his idea so fully as he wished to do. But it is only justice to bear in mind that his ideal was far in advance of his age, as Guizot has said. Chapter 11. Sumptuary Laws. Calvin and Farel Banished. Geneva stands or falls with its morality, code of morals, dances, etc. The sumptuary laws earlier than Calvin's time. Rise of the Libertine Party. Outcries. Demand for the abolition of the new code. The Libertines obtain a majority in the council. Byrne interferes adversely. Question of unleavened bread. Confusion and disorders in Geneva. Calvin and Farel refuse to dispense the communion at Easter. Tumult in the churches. Farel and Calvin banished by the council. Calvin's theological code was followed by one of the morals. There were few cities in Christendom that had greater need of such a rule than the Geneva of that day. For centuries it had known almost nothing of moral discipline. The clergy were notoriously decadent. The government was tyrannical, and the people, in consequence, were demoralized. Geneva had but one redeeming trait, the love of liberty. The institutions of learning were neglected, and the manners of the Genevans were as rude as their passions were violent. They reveled, they danced, they played at cards, they fought in the streets, they sung indecent songs, uttered fearful blasphemies, indulged, in short, all sorts of excesses. It was clear that Protestantism must cleanse the city or leave it. Geneva was nothing unless it was moral. It could not stand a day. This was the task to which Calvin now turned his attention. This introduces the subject of the sumptuary laws, which were sketched at this time, though not finished until a later period. The rules now framed forbade games of chance, oaths and blasphemies, dances, lascivious songs, farces and masquerades. The hours of taverns were shortened. Everyone was to be at home by 9 at night. The hotel keepers were to see that these rules were observed by their guests. To these were added certain regulations with a view of restraining excess in dress and profusion at meals. All were enjoined to attend sermons and other religious exercises. Even before the time of Calvin, under the Roman Church, most of these practices, and especially dances, had been forbidden under severe penalties. 40 years after his death, under Henry IV of France, similar edicts were promulgated. The British government at this day adopts the principle of the Genevan regulations when it forbids gambling, indecent pictures and plays, and similar immoralities. And if such laws are justifiable now, how much more so in Calvin's time, when there were scarcely any amusements that were innocent. The second battle with the citizens proved a harder one than the first with the priests, and the reformation of manners more difficult task than the reformation of beliefs. The citizens remembered the halcyon days when they enjoyed under their bishops, and contrasted them with the moral restraints imposed upon them by the consistory. The reproofs which Calvin thundered against their vices from the pulpit were intolerable to many, perhaps to most. The population was a mixed one. Many were still papists at heart. Some were Anabaptists, and others were deeply tainted with that infidel and materialistic philosophy which had been growing quietly up under the shade of the Roman Church. The successful conflict the Genevans had waged for their political independence helped, too, to make them less willing to bow to the Protestant yoke. Was it not enough that they had shed their blood to have the gospel preached to them? It was mortifying to find that very Protestantism which they had struggled to establish turning round upon them, and weighing them in its scales, and finding them wanting. Loud and indignant cries were raised against Calvin for neglecting his office, appointed to be an expositor of Scripture. Who made him, asked his critics, a censor of morals and a reprover of the citizens? Religion, in the age gone by, had been too completely disassociated from morality to make the absurdity of this accusation palpable. The libertines, as the oppositionists began now to be called, demanded the abolition of the new code. They complained especially of the excommunication. What, said they, have we put down one popish confessional only to set up a Protestant one? And mounting party badges, they wore green flowers in mockery of the other citizens, calling them brothers in Christ. The government began to be intimidated by these clamors. The majority of the citizens being still on the side of the ministers, the council ventured on issuing an edict commanding the libertines to leave the city. But it had not the courage to enforce its own order, and the libertines, seeing its weakness, grew every day more insolent. At length, the elections of February 1538 gave a majority in their favor in the council. 3 out of the 4 syndics were on the side of the libertines. This turn of affairs placed the pastors in a position of extreme difficulty. They stood in front of a hostile council, pushed on from behind by a hostile population. Calvin remained firm. His resolution was taken unalterably to save his principle. Come what might to himself, he was determined at all hazards not to give holy things to unholy men, for he saw that with that principle must stand or fall the Reformation in Geneva. While these internal convulsions shook the city within, invasion threatened it without. The strife of the citizens were the signal to their old enemies to renew their attempts to recover Geneva. The inhabitants fortified the walls, cast the superfluous bells into the cannon, and placed them upon the ramparts. Alas, this would avail but little, seeing they were all the while pulling down that which was their true defense. With their morality was bound up their Protestantism, and should it depart, not all their stone walls should prevent their becoming once more the prey to Rome. At this stage the matter was still further embroiled by the interference of Bern. The government of that powerful canton, ambitious of assuming the direction of affairs at Geneva, counseled the Genevese to restore certain ceremonies which had been retained in the Bernese Reformation, but cast off in the Genevan one, among others holidays, and the use of unleavened bread in the communion. Calvin and Farel demurred to the course recommended. The moment the sentiments of the pastors became known, a vehement zeal seized the libertines to have the Lord's Supper dispensed with unleavened bread. The government decided that it should be as the libertines desired. With Calvin, a much greater question was whether the communion should be given to these persons at all. As Easter approached, the fury of the party increased. They ran through the streets at night, vociferating and yelling. They would stop before the pastors' houses, calling out, "To the Rhone, to the Rhone," and would then discharge their firearms. They parodied in masquerade that very ordinance which their consciences would not permit them to receive save with unleavened bread. Frightful confusion prevailed in Geneva. This is attested by eyewitnesses and by those who had the best opportunity of knowing the truth of what they have narrated. Popery had indeed been forsworn, says Beza, but many had not cast away with it those numerous and disgraceful disorders which had for a long time flourished in the city, given up as it was for so many years to canons and impure priests. Nothing was to be heard, says Rosé, but information and quarrels between the former and present lords, the old and new members of council, some being the ringleaders, and others following in steps. The whole mingled with reproaches about the booty taken in the war, or the spoils carried off from the churches. I have lived here, says Calvin himself, describing those agitations, engaged in strange contests. I have been saluted in mockery of an evening before my own door, with 50 or 60 shots of firearms. You may imagine how that must astound a poor scholar, timid as I am, and as I confess I always was. It was amid these shameful scenes that the day arrived, which was to show whether the libertines backed by the council, or Calvin, supported by his own great principle, would give way. On the morning of Easter, 1538, the great bell of Clements rung out its summons, and all the quarters of the city poured out their inhabitants to fill the churches. Farel ascended the pulpit of St. Gervais. Calvin occupied that of St. Peter's. In the audience before them, they could see the libertines in great force. All was calm on the surface, but a single word might let loose the winds and awake the tempest. Nevertheless, they would do their duty. The pastors expounded the nature of the Lord's Supper. They described the dispositions required in those who would worthily partake of it, and appealing to the disorders which had reigned in the city in the past weeks, in proof that these were not the dispositions of the majority of those now assembled, they concluded by intimating that this day the Holy Supper would not be dispensed. Hereupon, outcries drowned the voice of the preachers. The uproar was especially great in St. Gervais. Swords were unsheathed, and furious men rushed toward the pulpit. Farel waited with his arms crossed. He had long since learned to look on angry faces without trembling. Calvin in St. Peter's was equally resolute. Sooner should this blood dye the boards he stood upon than he would be guilty of the profanation demanded of him. We protest before you all, he said, that we are not obstinate about the question of bread, leavened or unleavened. That is a matter of indifference, which is left to the discretion of the Church. If we decline to administer the Lord's Supper, it is because we are in a great difficulty, which prompts us to this course. Farel had borne the brunt of the tempest in the morning. It was to be Calvin's turn in the evening. On descending to the Church of the Rive, the former convent of St. Francis, near the shores of the lake, he found the place already filled with an assembly, many of whom had brought their swords with them. Whatever apprehensions the young reformer may have felt, he presented to the assembly, which hung upon the edge of the storm, a calm and fearless front. He had not been more than 18 months in their city, and yet he had inspired them with an awe greater than that which they felt, even for Farel. These two men were of the same spirit, as of the same office, and yet they were unlike. The Genevans saw the difference. Farel was the man of oratory. Calvin was the man of power. In what attribute or faculty, or combination of faculties, his power lay, they would have had great difficulty in saying. Certainly it was not in his gestures, nor in his airs, nor in the pomp of his rhetoric, for no one could more sedulously eschew these things. But that he did possess a power, calm, inflexible, resistless power, they all knew, for they all felt it. Farel's invectives and denunciations were terrible. His passion was grand, like the thunderstorm of their own Alps. But there was something in the noise that tempered his severity and softened his accusations. Calvin never thundered and lightened. Had he done so, it would have been a relief. The Genevans would have felt him to be more human and genial, a man of like passions with themselves, at least, of like passions with Farel, whom they regarded with a mixture of love and fear, and whom they could not help half forgiving, even when he was rousing their anger by his reproaches. But in his terrible calmness, in his passionless reason, Calvin stood apart and rose above all around him, above Farel, even above the council, whose authority was dwarfed before the moral majesty that seemed to clothe this man. He was among them like an incarnate conscience. His utterances were decrees, just and inflexible, like the laws of heaven themselves. When had he come, this mysterious and terrible man? Noyon was his birthplace, but what influences had molded such a spirit, and what chance was it which had thrown him into their city to hold them in this spell, and rule them as neither bishop, nor duke, nor pope had been able to rule them? They would try whether they could not break his yoke. For this end they had brought their swords with them. The historians who were eyewitnesses of the scene that followed are discreet in their accounts of it. It did not end as tragically as it threatened, and instead of facts that would not redound to the honor of their city, they treat us to felicitations that the affair had no worse a termination. What the words were that evoked the tempest we do not know. It was not necessary that they should be strong, seeing the more violent, the more welcome would they be. While Calvin is preaching, we see a dark frown pass suddenly over the faces of the assembly. Instantly there come shouts and outcries. A moment later, the clatter of weapons being hastily unsheathed salutes our ears. The next, we are dazzled by the gleam of naked swords. The tempest has burst with tropical suddenness and violence. The infuriated men, waving their weapons in the face of the preacher, press forward to the pulpit. One single stroke, and Calvin's career would have ended. And not only his, with him would have ended the career of Geneva as the new foothold of the Reformation. Farel had felt the burden too heavy for him, and had Calvin fallen, we know of no one who could have taken his place. What a triumph for Rome, who would have re-entered Geneva over the mangled corpse of the reformer. But what a disaster to Europe, the young day of which would have been quenched in the blackness of a twofold night, that of a rising atheism and that of a returning superstition. But the movement was not fated so to end. He who had scattered the power of emperors and armies when they stood in battle array against the Reformation, stilled the clamors of the furious mobs when they rose to extinguish it. The same buckler that covered Luther in the Diet of Worms was extended over the head of Calvin amid the glittering swords in the Church of the Rive. In that assembly were some who were the friends of the reformer. They hastily threw themselves between the pulpit and the furious men who were pressing forward to strike. This check gave time to the less hostile of Calvin's foes to recover their senses, and they now remonstrated with the more violent on the crime they were about to commit, and the scandal they would cause if they succeeded in their object. Their anger began to cool. First one, then another put back his sword into its sheath, and after some time calm was restored. Michael Rosé, the chronicler and magistrate, who appears to have been present, says, with an evident sense of relief, the affair passed off without bloodshed, and the words of the syndic, Gautier, who reckoned its peaceable ending a sort of miracle, show how near it had been to having a very different termination. The reformer's friends did not think it prudent to leave him undefended, though the storm seemed to have spent itself. Forming an escort around him, they conducted him to his home. On the morrow the council of 200 met, and pronounced sentence of banishment upon the two ministers. This sentence was ratified on the following day by the council general, or assembly of the people. On the decision being intimated to Calvin, he replied with dignity, "Had I been the servant of man, I should have received but poor wages. But happy for me it is that I am the servant of him who never fails to give his servants that which he has promised them." The council rested its sentence of banishment upon the question of unleavened bread. Herein it acted disingenuously. The pastors had protested that the question of leavened or unleavened bread in the Eucharist was with them an open one. The real ground of banishment is one on which the magistrates of Geneva, for obvious reasons, are silent, namely, the refusal of Farel and Calvin to celebrate the Lord's Supper, on account of the blasphemies and immoralities indulged by many of those who demanded admission to the communion table. Before being condemned, Calvin asked to be heard in his defense before the Council General, but this request was refused. It is important to mark at this stage that the principle on which the Reformer rested his whole scheme of church government was, holy things are not to be given to the unholy. This principle he labored to make inviolable, as being the germ, in the first place, of purity in the church, and, in the second, of morality and liberty in the state. The principle was, as we have seen, on this its first attempt to assert itself, cast out and trodden under foot of an infidel democracy. That party, in the days of Calvin, was only in its first sprouting. It has since grown into greatness, and put forth its strength on a wider theater. And the world has seen it, particularly in France, pull down and tread into the dust kings and hierarchies. But Calvin's principle, being divine, could not perish under the blows now dealt it. It was overborne for the moment, and driven out of Geneva in the persons of its champions, but it lifted itself up again, and re-entering Geneva, was there, 15 years afterwards, crowned with victory. Thank you all for taking your time to listen to the history of Protestantism. Please like this recording wherever it is that you are listening to it. And as a special favor, I ask you all to go to crosstheborder.org and click on the cover of the volume that you are listening to, which will take you to the appropriate Amazon page. And please leave a 5-star review there and a brief comment about something that you've heard or read in that volume. Thank you so much for taking that little bit of extra time to support us.